Um, I've had some conversations over the past week or so, and it's interesting how different people's perspectives started bubbling in the back of my brain. It is very true that Christianity is meant, or Christians are not exempt from suffering. And I think we need to keep focus on the fact that when we talk about being exempt from God's wrath, it's strictly and clearly we're talking about the wrath he's bringing as a part of his end times plan to bring the culmination of this world's history. Um, we see throughout the New Testament. I mean, it should be obvious from the New Testament that Christians can and do suffer, not only suffering in the physical sense, the mental sense, economically, emotionally, um, but it's also as far as in our belief system, we're not exempt. Just because we serve the one true God doesn't mean that we're automatically kept from any suffering because of that. I think it's notable that of the apostles, including Apostle Paul, only John died potentially of a natural causes. Now I don't think we ultimately know that he didn't, but he was exiled after intense, I'll just call it torture, um, where he was, at least according to the story I read, he was, well, I'll just say they attempted to boil him alive and he didn't die. So, but that doesn't mean that he necessarily looked like it was in real great physical shape afterwards. But God obviously preserved him because he had something left to do. So he was exiled and he was given the revelation that we know as the book of Revelation. So I think just by looking at what happened to God's principal servants, we know that there was suffering and persecution to the point of death. And in our world today, we see the same thing. We're blessed to be in the freest country in the world. Um, for all of its faults and all of the things that are going wrong today, is Pastor Kurt and I were talking about this, which is what country would you rather go to? And it's like, you know, in my naivete, in my stupidness, I once thought that, a place like Canada or, England or some European country might be even more free. But certainly over the past year, it's become clear that that's not the case. Um, and so we do have that freedom, but even in the world today, there are people dying because of their faith. China, Iran, Russia, all kinds of places people are suffering for their faith. And there's no guarantee that we won't as well. Certainly, we can see the beginnings of signs. I remember when 15, 18 years ago, Kurt was on a big kick about his belief that churches would eventually need to go underground in the United States, and we would need to switch to being home churches. And there was a time where the leadership openly talked, well, openly with it was a reoccurring conversation about selling this property, because not well for a lot of different reasons, mainly financial. But there was a thought that, and certainly Kurt was a big proponent of it, that we wouldn't be able to, at some point, be able to meet publicly. And at the time, it seemed like a very ridiculous notion. But in a way, he was a little prescient because I no longer think that. I think if the Lord decides to tarry, um, by the time Jenna is 25, 30, she may not live in a country where she can openly worship God. It's certainly, maybe if it's not persecution of death, it will be at least um, the scorn and the isolation that we see happening to other people in our country who take a stand for things. That you guys followed what happened in LA this past weekend, where people were protesting a certain thing, and I don't want to get too much into the news, but they were protesting something that was, if you knew what it was, you'd say, well, that's a good thing. And they were attacked and punched and beaten for standing up for something that at least 2 or 3 years ago, 95% of the people would say, yes, that's ridiculous and that's wrong and so forth. And now that gets you a beating. And how far it's going to go in our country is dependent on how long the Lord decides to tarry. But one, lately I've never been. I no longer feel like I'm going to miss out if I'm not on this planet 20, 25 years from now. I feel like you know, I think I've done what I need to do here. Now that's up to God, but I don't any longer cling to the things of this world any longer. Now, could that change? Yes. I mean, politics is like a wave, it goes back and forth. But as I look at prophecy and then compare it to things I see in the world, it seems to me God's setting things up. Now, if I lived during World War II, would I have felt the same way? Probably. And if I lived in the 60s during the Cold War, would I felt the same way? Probably. So I don't know if that's just a symptom of us as older Christians looking at the world and thinking, okay, I'm ready to exit. But ultimately, God decides that exit, not us. And we're all hoping that He, just brings the good thing. But we have to be prepared, both to live this life out and also, and this isn't something I wanted to say, but somebody rightly pointed out the fact that I cannot be 100% confident that, come on in, I can't be 100% confident that the pre-tribulation rapture is the correct view. No, that's okay. I honestly took a second look through the passages that I believe point to a pre-tribulational rapture, and some of them if you have the opposite mindset in place, I think you can put together a coherent argument that the post-tribulational rapture is a viable alternative. Now, I do find a couple things that I would need to have explained first, because there are certain things that in my mind stand out as that contradicts that. But as I stand before you or sit before you tonight, as a elder of this church, it would not be responsible of me to guarantee you the fact that you will not at least see the Antichrist on your television set. Um, yeah. Hi, welcome. Yeah. Thank you, John.
There are churches in Canada today, and Trudeau says it's understandable.
Yeah. Right. Well, and from our perspective, not having grown up in America, it's hard to imagine that being the case. But we've got to remember that literally, let's see, 700 years ago, people who were standing up for the faith in Jesus and the truth of the Bible were being tortured and to recant, and if not, they were burnt at the stake. So um, we have to realize that, I guess where I was going with the introduction sort of preamble was we don't know. We hope, and I'm going in 2 weeks' time. I'm going to try to present a coherent argument for the pre-tribulational rapture, but certainly it would be irresponsible of me to guarantee it. But I do think, and as I'll make my case, I do think that there is significant evidence to point in that direction. And I'm going to, as somebody who as recently as 3 or 4 years ago was really in flux about what I believed, Matt and I really literally would go around. I'd visit him in his office and we would literally spend an hour talking. And at the end of that hour, I probably left more confused than I was going in. I'm going to present the one piece of evidence that really won me over and in my mind solidified my belief in pre-trib rapture. But ultimately, I think we need to realize that this isn't a doctrine in which we divide over. And there is a reason that we haven't put it in our doctrinal statement. That many churches do, including maybe our church 40 years ago might have had that our doctrinal statement had a stand on eschatology. But I think there's hope, and I'm going to demonstrate that hope. But we need to plan on the fact that Christianity, even in the short term, is not going to be that popular a thing. I've tried to be open in my faith at work over the past, how long have I been working now? 30 years, and um, I've generally not encountered anybody who gave me a hard time over it. Hi, Karen. No, don't be sorry. I'm still in my pre-ramble, as we call it. I, I, I've never really suffered any blowback from it. I don't necessarily expect that to continue, but we'll see. God is got a plan, and the worst part is we don't know exactly what it is. So we're just going to have to be open to it. 6:45. I better dive in. As you know, I'm not famous for getting through a lot of my material. So what I did tonight is, and I said this at the beginning of last week, and it's going to be doubly true tonight. I'm going to skim over some stuff that probably some of you would wish I didn't. I want to finish the tribulation tonight, so I've edited out a lot of material. So we are really going to skim over some of the stuff that I was going to cover tonight. But I'll try not to do it in too frustrating a manner. But having said that, if you leave a little frustrated, then I probably accomplished my task, which will be to encourage you to dive deeper. There's plenty of resources to go way beyond what my understanding is of things. And if that's what you want, I definitely can point you at resources, both book-wise, but especially video-wise, that will give you a lot of good teaching on the subject. Okay, so where we've been the past 3 weeks, including tonight, is we've been trying to digest Daniel 9:27, which basically I think we've been on since week 2, is trying to wrestle with this prophecy given to Daniel in the Old Testament, where is predicted a time in which God would deal with the Jewish nation and then he would be done. And we learned that the last 7 years of the prophecy is yet in the future. And so we talked about that. If you want to catch up, go to the website. You can listen through some of the old stuff, or at least walk through the PowerPoint presentation, or the presentations that I have up there. But this is basically the outline of the last week of Daniel's prophecy, which corresponds to what I believe corresponds to the tribulation period, which is the starting of a peace treaty. And halfway through, there's this event that happens that causes the Jewish temple, which has been rebuilt at this point, to become desecrated. And then at that point, well, we're going to cover this review a little bit. But at the end part of this will be the second coming of Jesus, as he predicted in Acts chapter 1 when he left, that he would be coming back So let's go over what we looked at the first 2 weeks ago, which is the first 3.5 years. So um, I'm probably going to have to read off the board tonight because the, something happened with my laptop and my font's really small and I didn't bring my glasses. So okay, so and again, briefly, if you want this stuff in detail, go back to the recording 2 weeks ago. You can get that. So we starts off with the peace treaty. We talked about that. The peace treaty is going to be with the Antichrist and with the Jewish nation. It's going to be the peace that the Jewish nation's always been looking for. They're finally going to get that in writing. And then I believe right afterwards, the Ezekiel 38, where we're going to talk about those first two things again tonight in a different context. But we'll talk about that again. World politics, we talked about how it's going to continue on towards a one world government, and that government will eventually be taken, the Antichrist will be put at the head of that. We talked about the Jewish temple being rebuilt. We talked about these two witnesses. Um, it's my belief that the Bible teaches that God never leaves the world without a witness for him. And so when the church is raptured, there's going to be an absence of people advocating for God. And so I think the first presence he will reestablish is these two witnesses that Revelations chapter 11 talks about. And then eventually we're going to see the 144,000 Jewish evangelists, what I like to think of as 144,000 Apostle Pauls, blanketing the earth with the gospel. While they're doing that, at the same time, the rest of the world is coming, uniting behind a one religion where everything is accepted. You know, everybody's right, nobody's wrong, multiple paths to heaven. Um, you know, if you've heard anything of the religion Chrislam, where they're trying to combine Christianity and Islam into one religion, the Pope is really hot on that right now, and seeing that happen, I think that's an example where the gospel of Jesus gets watered down to the point where it's ineffective, and I think that's how that the Bible teaches is that this one religion is going to sort of dominate society the way I think if you and I'm not comparing these two, so don't take what I'm saying a different way. But I think the way you see the ecology movement with climate change and all this stuff, the 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 passion that people have for that in society, where it becomes almost like a religion for them, I think that I think that kind of passion is going to be combined into this one world religion where Mother Earth and Gaia is taught, and we owe service to the earth and so forth. So I think that one religion is really going to become an amalgamation of different beliefs where everybody can feel happy and content within it and real passionate. And you can see how that could really influence a society to the point where everybody is sort of, behind it and pushing it. And if you go against it, you're not going to be very popular.
So you throw logic right out the window.
Well, it's certainly when you it does not have any room for there's one way to heaven, which is what Jesus, when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the light, that does not have any room in a one world religion where everybody is on the right path. Okay, I don't want to get too bogged down in just my introduction. So last week we talked about this, the midpoint, where we see the Antichrist is killed, Satan is cast down from heaven. So we see Antichrist is killed, Revelation 11. Satan is cast down from heaven, Revelation 12. Antichrist is resurrected, back to Revelation 11. Mark of the beast. So we talked about that, and we talked about the fact that all attempts to, call the vaccine or social security numbers or anything else is not the mark of the beast. That there's a specific set of circumstances for something to come about, and that needs all of this other stuff to be in place for that to be implemented. So we see a one world economic system put in place where you have to be a member of the group in order to buy or sell things, and that membership involves taking the mark. We talked about the abomination of desolation. It seems like we talked about that every week, but we brought that into what it really actually means regarding the temple in Jerusalem. We see that peace treaty that we saw at the beginning of the tribulation. It's actually broken, and the persecution of the Jews begins, and the two witnesses are killed. We're going to pick up tonight with the second to last bullet point, the persecution of the Jews, as we jump into the new material. So the last 3.5 years, and this really is focused heavily on the end of the 3.5 years as we get to the end of that 7-year period Daniel talks about. So the first thing we see are the Jews persecuted to near extinction, and a third of the Jews turned to Jesus. And so this is prophesied about in the Old Testament. So first of all, we'll look at two passages. First one's in Zechariah chapter 13. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. I will turn my hand against the little ones. In the whole land, declares the Lord, 2/3 shall be cut off and perish, and 1/3 shall be left alive. And I will put this third into the fire, and refine them as one refines silver, and test them as gold is tested. They will call upon my name, and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is my God. And so this is the redemption. We see here a prophecy about the redemption of the Jewish people, where 2/3 of them will continue in their rejection of Jesus. And as I mentioned, what we talked about last week, the persecution of the Jews is going to be similar to where it was in Hitler in World War II, except for the fact that the goal is to drive them to extinction. And so 2/3 of them are going to, over the course of that 3.5 year period, be killed. But there is going to be a remnant that is chosen um, to turn back to God, and it talks about them being refined. Maybe it was in the verse I had there. Yeah, and so this is talking about the tribulation period. And we talked about the time of Jacob's trouble when we were talking about the name of the tribulation, Jacob being Israel. God is going to bring the tribulation on the Jewish people for a reason, and they're going to. It talks about them being refined. We talked. Well, I'll put a pin in what I was going to say. Come back to it, but they are going to be persecuted, and the persecution is going to lead to some of them turning and reestablishing fellowship and faith in God through a recognition of Jesus as the Messiah, which is what we talked about several weeks ago. Was the whole point of the triumphal entry, the Palm Sunday, was Jesus offering himself as Messiah, and they turned him down. And soon afterwards, he said, "You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord.'" And this is a prediction that that's going to happen. Eventually, they are going to turn to faith in Jesus. We also have in Daniel chapter 12. Now, this is pulled in the middle of a prophecy, so I'll try to explain a little bit what's being said here. And I heard the man clothed in linen who was above the waters, the stream. He raised his right hand and his left hand towards heaven and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and a half a time, and that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things will be finished. So time, we talked a little bit, maybe way back in week 2. This is talking about a 3.5 year period. And I believe it's specifically talking about that last 3.5 year period that we are currently looking at. I'll jump ahead a little bit. So we're talking about this 3.5 year period, and specifically, it's talking again about the shattering of the power of the holy people. And that is again what we talked about last week a little bit. God's plan for the Jewish people is to knock them down so that they look up, that they have nowhere else to look but back to God. And we talked about during that desecration of the temple last week that they're finally going to turn back to God and say, realized that Jesus was that Messiah that they've been looking for. That the Jewish people, I think one of the keys to understanding why Jesus wasn't a popular candidate for the Messiah back when he presented himself was most of the Jewish people were looking for a political savior. They were looking for somebody to come and throw off the yoke of the Roman rule, to set up a kingdom in Jerusalem. Because remember, when when we first started looking at Daniel, we talked about the fact that they're eventually, at the time this prophecy was made, they were still in captivity in Babylon. But that didn't last very long. The prophecy starts off with saying that they're going to be able to go back to their land, but it never said that they would be able to be ruled. That kingdom that exists in David's time and in Solomon's time and existed all the way up to the Babylonian captivity, they were self-governed. When they returned to Jerusalem and rebuilt those walls and rebuilt the temple, they were not self-governed anymore. They were still under, at that time, they would have been under the Persian Empire. And when, yes, under Darius and the people who followed him. And when Alexander the Great took over and defeated the Persians, Israel came underneath the Greek Empire, and then eventually the Roman Empire came along, and they became. Now, I'm not saying that the Israel didn't try to become free. There was many. The Jewish people have had a reputation for being very hard to govern, because no matter who was over them, they were constantly trying to rebel. And so whoever was over them would constantly have to send armies in to put down the rebellion. And the Jewish history is all about that. And the Jewish people felt that when the Messiah finally came, he would once and forever get rid of all kinds of Gentile rule that had been over them, and they would again become self-governing with the Messiah as their king. And the Messiah would, as predicted in the Old Testament, he would reign over the entire earth. That's what they were looking for. And so when Jesus comes along in humility and talking about, a moral transformation of their lives, repenting and so forth, that was foreign to them. That's not what they're looking for. They were looking for somebody to come and say, let's take up arms and let's throw off the oppression. So the problem is they cherry picked the Old Testament verses that talked about the reigning of Christ without looking at the fact that the Messiah was going to suffer. And so it wasn't until the church was established that the Apostle Paul and some of the other apostles looked back at the teaching of the Old Testament and say, well, it was clearly there. We just refused to see it because we were looking for something else. And so how did I get off on that rabbit trail? Let me see if I can walk all the way back here. The shattering of the power of the holy people is them, God finally impressing upon him the fact that the Messiah that they've been looking for already came. And as Zechariah teaches, 1/3 of them will come to faith in Jesus, and those people will be preserved to the end of the times. And I talked about the Antichrist. His goal during this period is going to wipe out the Jewish people so that there can't be a millennial kingdom, because the millennial kingdom talks about Jesus and the Jewish people reigning from Jerusalem. If there's no Jews left, then there's no reign. But the fact of the matter is, God will protect his remnant and make sure that when the millennial kingdom comes, people be human beings to go into that, because eventually there's going to be a repopulation of the entire earth, similar to what we saw in Noah's day, and that's going to come during that time period. So there's a lot more that could be said about that, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on at that point. So this one world religion we've been talking about is going to be destroyed. Now, this is where we're getting really close to the end of the 3.5-year period at this point. Most of the last 3.5-year period that Revelation talks about is pretty much exclusively focused on the Jewish nation and how they're being persecuted. So there's not a lot to really talk about here. But as we get to the end of the period, the Revelations talks about the destruction of what's called Babylon. Now, there's a lot of theories about who Babylon is. A lot of people want to make Babylon into something else other than Babylon. The popular theories out there is the Catholic Church, um, I'm sorry, there was one other and it jumped out of my head. But there are a couple of theories about what Babylon is. My personal belief is I believe Babylon's Babylon. I think the people who want to make Babylon into something other than Babylon are the same people who wanted to make prophecies about the future of Jerusalem and the nation of Israel into something else because at the time they were looking at things, the nation of Israel didn't exist. And so I think it's too easy to try to make things non-literal that could be literal. And since there's no there's nothing in the passage that specifically calls for it to be something other than Babylon, that's my personal belief. Definitely my opinion only. So I'm not, no way should anybody be dogmatic about this. But I do want to, let's look at Revelation chapter 18, where it talks about this one religion being destroyed. And after this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called with a mighty voice, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living." So what this is talking about here really is um, God in the Old Testament compares the Jewish nation when they would go off and worship other gods. It was compared to being unfaithful to God, and so this sexual immorality calls back to that unfaithfulness. And this, that's really interesting. I don't think I picked the right verses here because we were supposed to look at the fall of Babylon, and I didn't really. Oh, I'm sorry, I did. Um, so it was all the way back here. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. Okay, sorry, I needed to recenter myself for a second. Um, so the key here is that the one world religion is finally judged by God, and this is something sent from heaven, um, destruction. And Babylon, if you're wondering about why Babylon, so if you look back all the way back to Genesis chapter 10, when you have the people after Noah trying to centralize around the Tower of Babel. What was going on at the Tower of Babel? I could spend at least one session just talking about that. But the upshot is that's the beginning of every false religion that existed during the time of the Jewish nation and the Old Testament came out of there. And so, without spending a lot of time on there, the Tower of Babel was sort of the origin of false religions, and it's going to come to a accumulation where at some point something is going to be judged um, as far as false religions, and it's going to be God's finally going to wipe that out. And so this is sort of a prior to him coming back, he's just sort of going to put the pin in this history of human beings turning away from him towards false gods. So as I said last week, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this portion of it because there's a lot to spend time on, and I really want to cover other things tonight. And that keeps moving as I notice every week. Make mention of. So finally we're to which is well some good stuff. So we at the same time we're going to have three significant events happen. Finally, we're going to get to the second coming of Christ, of Jesus, as prophesied. We're going to have the Battle of Armageddon, and we're going to have the Antichrist and false prophet finally defeated. So God gave them their time on the earth, and now it's going to be revoked. Let's look at some scripture here in Revelation chapter 19. Then I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, crowns, and he has a name written that no one else knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God. And the armies of heaven arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. I believe this is the church coming back with him. Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and with a loud voice he called to all the birds that fly directly overhead, "Come gather for the great supper of God, and eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men." So this is pointing to a great carnage that is going to happen here at the Battle of Armageddon. There's going to be a lot of dead people and dead animals, obviously. The flesh of horse and the riders, of the horses and the riders, and the flesh of all men, both free and slave, both small and great. And I saw the beasts and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against him who was sitting on the horse and against his army. And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet, and in its presence had done the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped its image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. Okay, I trimmed out a couple verses there. So essentially, what we're seeing here, Jesus coming back into earth, just as the people of earth were gathered together to finally wipe out the Jewish nation once and for all. We talked about the Ezekiel 38 war last week. This is going to be even a bigger group of people that are coming together, and it's once and for all we're going to wipe out Israel and the Jewish nation and just wipe them from the face of the planet. And Jesus comes back, intervenes. The armies of the earth turn to fight him, and it's basically no contest. And we see the Antichrist and false prophet are finally judged. So
The false prophet is going to be basically the one who is leading this world religion.
yes, and the specifically the worship of the image of the beast. But yes, I think yes, that's the world religion. At some point, will go from the worship of everything we talked about last week about how he will insist it becomes the worship of one thing, which is himself. So in that sense, he puts them up to be the term Antichrist becomes in true reality as he became a substitute for Christ who demands to be worshipped exclusively. And so, and then the last thing we see is the resurrection of the Old Testament and tribulation saints. We talked about the church will be resurrected at the rapture, but as far as the Old Testament saints, they will not get their bodies until the end of the tribulation. So you can find this in Daniel chapter 12. At this time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people. So this is Michael the archangel, who his job really, as Daniel tells us, is the protection of the Jewish nation. And so at this time, Michael the great prince has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never been since there was a nation till that time. So again, we're talking about the tribulation here. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book of life. So that third that Zechariah talked about, we see talked about here. Every Jewish person whose name is found written in the book will be delivered. And notice again, keep saying your people, your people. That's talking to Daniel. This is the Jewish nation we're talking about here. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. So, as the Bible clearly teaches, especially the New Testament, to be absent with the body is to be present with the Lord. So these Old Testament saints are in heaven, but they haven't been reunited with their bodies, and neither has been the church era saints. The church era saints will get their bodies back at the rapture, and we looked a little bit at that several weeks ago, and we'll look at that again next session. But the church shall get their bodies then, but the Old Testament saints will get their bodies back at the end of the tribulation time. At the end of at that time, your people shall be delivered, and then they're reunited with their bodies. And then we see the 140 the tribulation saints, the 144,000 witnesses, and the people that came to faith through their testimony. In Revelation 20 verse 4, we see, and now this is after remember, Revelations 19 is the second coming of Jesus. So this is after he's come back to, set up his authority there here. And then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those who had authority to judge, to whom authority to judge was committed. Now I could stop and talk about that. I'm going to forbear. Also, I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and for those who had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. And so we see that them get their resurrection bodies at that point. And so we see God's people total at the beginning of the millennial period here, because that's where we are, is the end of the tribulation and the beginning of the millennial period. We see everybody now fully given their resurrected bodies as we're about to end the millennial kingdom, and they're all ready to take part in full as members of, as followers of God. So that's where we. Let me jump way down here. I want to show you something, but unfortunately, it's way at the end of my notes. Yes, there we go. I don't know if I have a clear answer for you. I could hazard a guess, but I don't think it would be. I don't think I would feel comfortable hazarding the guess, since they haven't really looked at that at all that much. So I'm going to forbear. Well, share. So go ahead and share that. Oh, the Jewish people. You're right. That I've heard the same thing. So that would have been my answer if I had thought about it. Yes, the many does. So remember, and this ties back to what we looked at when we looked at the covenant. It said, and he who we determined was the Antichrist will make a covenant with many for 1 week. And we talked about the fact that the book of Daniel uses that term many to talk about the Jewish people. Yeah. Okay, sorry. I thought I might have seen a hand back there. So I showed this chart several times as we walk through several of these things, and I think we can start to see this chart a little bit more clearly as we looked at the church age. We're going to be looking at the end of the church age starting next time. We've been looking at this tribulation period, and we see the resurrection of the tribulation saints there at the same time as the Old Testament saints. We see the second coming of Jesus. We're at the portion of the millennial kingdom. Now, I did say during week 1 that I wouldn't be talking about the millennial kingdom, not because it isn't worth talking about, but for 2 reasons. First of all, I could spend probably a lot of time talking about it, and second of all, we don't have a lot of time for me to talk about it. So, but I do have. If you go to the website or the web page that I created, there is a book in there. It's very, very intense. But if you really are curious about what the millennial kingdom would be like and what the Bible has to say about it, there is a book there that I started and had to stop because it was too deep for where I wanted to be at that particular moment in time. But it is very thorough. So if you want that, go to the book recommendation section at the page, and you can get all the information you'd ever want on the millennial kingdom. But that's where we're going to stop, and we're actually going to sort of go backwards and talk. I want to go back to. So I talked about, looking at trying to figure out here. You know what? I think I accidentally. Oh, good. I thought I might have accidentally stopped the stream. Give me a second. I made an unscheduled detour. Okay, I think. Even if I wasn't here, or actually probably the week before, I wanted to look at the events of the tribulation from a earthly perspective, like sort of like a rip from the headlines type of thing, Well, now we're going to take a step backwards and go all the way back to the beginning of the tribulation, but this time we're going to look at it from a heavenly perspective. So that's the question was asked, are we going to see these things from heaven? And, what kind of things would we potentially see? Well, so the Revelations talks about these judgments. And um, so we're going to look at it from that perspective. What would it look like potentially if we were in heaven looking down? Um, so I showed this chart before, and I sort of waffled on not really feeling that I felt like the judgments were aligned correctly. But the more I looked at it, I think that it's probably as good an interpretation about how they might lay out as some. And so I want to sort of look at these. Well, technically, there are 21 judgments, but we're going to talk about the fact that there's not really 21 here. Did I hear somebody? Okay. So the interesting thing about these judgments, so we're going to have 7 sealed judgments, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. And then when the 7th seal is open, that starts the trumpet judgments. And when the 7th trumpet is sounded, that starts the bowl judgment. So if you've ever seen a telescope before where you sort of pull it out and it sort of like comes out, that's sort of how these judgments work, where the last judgment of one set sort of starts the judgment of the second set. So really the 7th seal judgment will encompass all of the trumpet judgments and all of the bowl judgments. So if you can imagine that, it's sort of like a telescope that might help you a little bit. But basically what we're going to see here are 21 judgments that God brings on the earth at this point. And remember, there's a purpose for this. We talked about why God would send judgment on this earth rather than just allowing judgment to take place from an eternal perspective, which is obviously at some point those who reject the free gift of salvation that God offers, there's a consequence. It's not going to be offered forever. At some point, that offer is taken away, and that will determine the destiny of the person who chooses to reject the gift of salvation. But these judgments should almost be seen as a mercy, because God is giving people, in my belief, so some people teach that once the tribulation starts, those who knew the truth of the gospel, there's no chance for salvation for them. I don't believe that. I believe that God is giving the people of earth a second chance to repent. And I think these 144,000 witnesses might be more effective in their testimony than maybe the church is today. One of the reasons is I've heard somebody say, why do we need the 144,000 witnesses when we have the church here? Well, to our shame, I think the church is losing its saltiness. I think that the church, what people from the outside might look and see as the church of God or the followers of God, are filled with people who are not really followers of God. I think there's a lot of reason to question motivations of Christians and so forth. I think at some point God needs to do a reset and start with another, come at it from a different perspective, so to speak. I do believe, so I guess let me just say this. I believe that the tribulation is a time of mercy of God saying, here's your last chance. I'm going to send a bunch of things on you that if you're paying attention, it should be obvious that it's me who's doing these things, that there's a God who's trying to get people's attention. And if I'm trying to get your attention, maybe you should be looking around for the message I'm trying to get to you. And so I believe that these really are mercies, because God knows that at some point your eternal destiny is determined. And so he's trying to get people to turn back to him. Now, I believe specifically the Jewish nation, because as we looked at it in Daniel's prophecy, that 70th week is for the Jewish nation. It talks about it being the Jewish nation, but the whole world is going to be a part of this. And I believe that God is not going to be ignoring the rest of the planet just because his focus is again on the Jewish nation. And I do believe that he wants people to repent. And I believe that Revelation teaches that there will be a multitude of people saved during this period of time. The unfortunate thing is they're going to pay. They're going to pay for their delay with a pretty severe price, as we talked about last week. As people who reject the Antichrist and his mark are going to be allowed to freely walk around and so forth. So I've heard people say, and I don't know, probably flippantly, I think I'll wait till the tribulation and then I'll come to salvation. And the response I heard was pretty, I liked, which is said, what makes you think if you can't live for Christ now, that you'll be willing to die for Christ then? When it really, following Christ is really going to mean a decision on you living or dying. Yes?
My question is, so is this just for the people that are alive at the time, or is this include people that have previously died, like in our time, who did not fully accept?
I believe that once you die, that's that's it. Your destiny is fulfilled. And I also believe that that God, it's my belief that God gives everybody an opportunity to make a decision. Now, the obvious discussion about this, and I'd had this discussion with Pastor Kurt just last week, which is about how can people who never heard the name of Jesus be expected to have accepted him as salvation. I don't want to go there tonight because I'm already at 7:25 and I'm not near where I want to be in the preface of material. But I will say this. The Bible clearly teaches that our God is a just and merciful God. I don't think and we talked about the age of accountability at some point with the rapture and how we don't believe that people don't have the capacity to accept Jesus are going to be judged by Jesus in that sense. We worship a loving and merciful God. So we should just expect that he is going to be loving and merciful to everyone. And all I'm really trying to say here is I believe that though these are going to be horrific things we're going to look at, they are a mercy from God in the sense that he's trying to get people's attention. Again, why would he punish people on earth if when they die they're going to spend eternity in hell? Well, there's a reason why. It's not because he wants to be extra cruel. He's giving people a last opportunity. Okay, so having said all that, I really just want to go through these things really quick so you've been exposed to them. This is the part I said you're going to be frustrated at because there's really no way that we could adequately cover these, certainly not in 20 minutes. And honestly, if I would have started here at the beginning of the thing, there would have been no way. This is a multi-week study. So I just want to expose them to you and tell you that there's more resources out there that can give you a lot better details than I would be able to do. Perhaps Pastor Matt at some point will do a study of the sealed trumpet and bowl judgments, and that would be pretty cool. But we're not going to do that tonight, no. So, no, I'm telling you that I believe Pastor Matt could teach a really good series on these judgments. The four horsemen of the apocalypse, you've heard that term? That's where that comes from. Yes, the four. So that comes from Revelation chapter 6, and that comes from the first four judgments of the seal judgments. So let's, holy cow. Did I edit too much here? Hold on, I gotta, some point my stuff went away here. Uh-oh. Okay, I don't know what happened, but here's all of them together. I was gonna reveal them one at a time. So the first horseman of the apocalypse is a white horse. Oh boy, I can't do this. I'm gonna give you my interpretation of what they are. Understand that this is highly disputed. As a matter of fact, I could invite Matt up here and he could give you an entirely different observation on what these are. But this is what I currently believe that the four horsemen of the apocalypse are. I think the first two are definitely debatable. The first horseman, I believe, is the political, the rise of the Antichrist in his political consolidation of his power. I believe that the second horseman or the second seal judgment it talks about war. And I believe that this specifically is the Ezekiel 38 war that we talked about a couple weeks ago. where people are going to come against the Jewish nation, and God's going to miraculously keep them from being wiped out. Um, then the third seal judgment is famine, and the fourth seal judgment is death of 25% of the world. And so I believe these things are going to happen during the first part of the tribulation, the first year or so. I will say that some people believe that these are not necessarily going to happen during the tribulation. I listened to one person recently whose opinion I respect, thinks that these are going to happen actually before the tribulation starts. And so that this is some of the seal judgments that are going to happen. And I do know of one person that believes that these, at least one person who believes that these are actually historical judgments, and that these had happened in the time from Christ's death until today, and that the seal judgments are actually judgments from the past. And the death of the 25% of the world, for example, might have been like during the bubonic plague or something like that. And so I believe that there is not enough described in this chapter to deal with that adequately. Again, I'm going to be giving you my interpretation of some of these things, but definitely understand that it's only my interpretation. That first of all, the Revelations doesn't have a lot of detail about these things, so there's no way to be dogmatic about them. And second of all, it's not clear. There's no timeline in these chapters, so it's sort of hard to place these on a timeline like we did with the last section of material. Okay, so having said that, those are the first four seal judgments. Let me go back. I meant to just tell you what the seal is. So what we in Revelations chapter 5, we see the seal being held by God the Father, and it's said that nobody is worthy to open the scroll. And then we see this picture of the lamb that looks like he had been slain, and so we can identify that with Jesus, and he is found worthy to read the scroll. Now the scroll is sealed with 7 seals. Now we don't deal with scrolls nowadays, so it's sort of hard to understand. But back in the day, when you had scrolls, in order to make sure that people could not, just open them, change them, and close them again, they were sealed with a wax seal. And so as the Lamb is opening the seal, the judgments are occurring. So that's when we talk about seal judgments. I should have started with that. We're talking about the Lamb, Jesus, opening up the seal, and he's breaking each seal as he's opening up this scroll. And when each seal is broken, one of these judgments occurs. So I should have presented that at the beginning. I'm sorry. I got a little too far ahead of myself here. So we see the first seal judgments, the first 4, which, if you've heard the term 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, that's sort of that. And then the 5th seal is martyrdom, as we see. So stuff in parentheses is really sort of my interpretation of things. So I interpret this as Christianity being outlawed at this point, and we start to see a general persecution of Christianity, but not specifically the one where we see during after the Antichrist has desecrated the temple and stuff. I see this is more of a general, the persecution of Christianity that's going on in China, in Iran, in Russia, places like this. It's going to break out into to the general population, I think. The 6th seal judgment is natural disasters, earthquakes and stuff. We're going to come back and look at that more specifically if we have enough time, because I want to make a more specific point about the 6th seal judgment. But remember, the 7th seal judgment, when it's open, that sort of starts the trumpet judgment. So we're going to jump ahead now to the trumpet judgments. So the first trumpet judgment is a third of the vegetation burns up. And then we see a third of the sea turning to blood. We see a third of the fresh water contaminated. A third of the sun, moon, and stars darkened. That's pretty interesting, because I've heard a lot of speculation on how that could potentially occur. Anywhere from pollutants in the atmosphere that would decrease the amount of light we're getting from celestial bodies. Other things. There's a lot of interesting things here. Again, we could stop and talk about these, but again, as you can see the clock as well as I can. So the fifth trumpet judgment is the locust loosed to torment but not kill people for 5 months. So we think of locusts, we think of they kill crops and stuff, but the locusts that are let go is description in Revelations to describe these creatures. Locust might not even be the correct term for them, but certainly creatures are loosened that are going to be able to uh, produce wounds that hurt but not killed. And that's going to happen for 5 months, according to the Revelation chapter 8 or 9. And then the sixth trumpet judgment is we see this army of 200 million destroying a third of mankind. A lot of people associate this with China. Um, I've heard a lot of people lately say that it's not going to be China, but it's going to be something else. I'm not going to really take a position on that right now. The Bible isn't clear, other than talking about the specific judgment. So we see the trumpet judgments here, and then obviously the seventh, as we've been talking about, the seventh trumpet is sounded, and that eventually kicks off the bowl judgments. And the bowl judgments, we see terrible sores on people with the mark. So um, we see that in that locust persecution, it only affected people that had taken the mark of the beast. Well, this judgment also only affects people who had the mark. People have talked about if it's like a tattoo or something, that potentially the ink causes some sort of sores. But I think some people try to provide an earthly explanation for what I simply see as a judgment of God, which is people who take the mark of the beast are going to be in various types of torment. We see the second bowl judgment. Now, when the bowl judgments hit, you got to understand this is God closing things down. He's getting ready to wrap up his plans for the earth, and so these bowl judgments are severe. And so again, in my belief, he is literally slapping people across the face, saying, "Wake up and see what I'm trying to tell you. I am here. I'm trying to get your attention. Turn back to me." And so he's being very, very open with things that can't be explained away from a natural perspective. He wants people to know this can only be happening from a God, and not a God that hates you, but a God that loves you. And so that doesn't sound, well, gee, you're going to kill all the ocean people, and then you tell me I'm supposed to be looking for a loving God. Well, remember, this isn't all they're getting. They're also getting this testimony of people, and they're believe me, these people will know the truth. It will be their decision on which way they're going to respond to it. But we see again the second trumpet judge or the second bowl judgment. Everything in the ocean dies. Third bowl judgment, all the fresh water is contaminated. Now I'm wondering at this point, if all the fresh water is contaminated, yeah, how are we going to survive at this point? So this is why I believe that the bowl judgments happen real quickly and towards the end of the uh, the tribulation, because some of these things I don't see how the earth recovers from. And remember, we read that verse that said, if God doesn't intervene, that no flesh would be saved, that if the times of these things weren't cut short, but that God will cut them short so that the elect, the people on the earth who were following Jesus at that time, will have a chance to survive, because it is his intent that people will survive these persecutions. Um, Sorry, I can't help but throwing in a little bit of commentary here. Intense heat scorches the earth, so that's the fourth bowl judgment. So imagine that Saturday when we have 111 degrees here, and we're thinking, "Oh my gosh, how am I surviving this?" Just think about if it was like 20 degrees hotter, and it's likely what it's going to be like, maybe even hotter. Complete darkness falls on the Antichrist capital. So we see this as judgment number 5, and it's always like, oh, that's a weird judgment. If it's really hot and then all of a sudden it gets dark, that would probably feel pretty nice. But the way that it's described in the book of Revelation, it doesn't sound very nice. So I'm just simply going to say appearances may be deceiving with some of these judgments here. Oh, complete darkness falls on the Antichrist capital. Oh, what is the Antichrist capital? I mean, are you asking me like where it's going to be? I don't know. I think it's Babylon, but I don't quote me on that. I mean, it's highly debatable. Yeah, I've heard many things. Um, I believe it's Babylon, but I probably well, and so your Euphrates River dries up as the sixth judgment, and that's to prepare that also talks about here about armies now being able to march west. And if you think about what's west of the Euphrates, well, just so happens that the nation of Israel happens to be west of the Euphrates. So I believe that the sixth bowl judgment is specifically about the Battle of Armageddon. And so we see that. Right.
That could happen if our sun was.
There's lots of different explanations. Yes, solar flares, asteroid hitting the Earth, a lot of different things. Um, Seventh trumpet judgment is the greatest earthquake ever, and 100-pound hailstones. So imagine that. So again, this is meant. I mean, the Bible, when the Bible calls this time, there's never been more suffering on the face of this planet up until this time, and will never be again. God isn't fooling around. He's literally telling you this is time you don't want to be a part of. And again, real briefly, I believe that this is the reason why I believe that the church won't be a part of this, is that we will not. Well, okay, I forgot. I've actually got slides here. I actually came put this in. As I was ripping stuff out, I came back and put this in. So there's this phrase called "Wrath of the Lamb," and the debate is, when does that start? So there are scripture passages here, and I was just about to launch into this diatribe, and I remember I actually have this here. So there are several passages in the New Testament talk about how, as Christians, we're not destined for God's wrath. So 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 10, and to wait for his Son from heaven, who he raised from the dead, Jesus, who rescues us from the coming wrath. So there's wrath that's coming, and Jesus is going to rescue us from that. For God did not appoint us to wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. So those who obtain salvation were not appointed to wrath. So the question is, we started off this study tonight talking about Christians going through tough times. So at what point does a tough time, including from historical examples as well as modern day examples, people being tortured and killed for their faith in Christ, well, that seems like to me pretty tough. So there is something specifically called the wrath of God, and we're protected from that. So what does that actually mean? So this is one of the reasons why I believe in the pre-tribulation rapture, because I believe that the wrath of God starts here. When the Lamb opened one of the seven seals, and I heard the voice of four living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come." I believe that this is the first seal judgment, and I believe that this is when the wrath of the Lamb begins, because he's opened up the first seal, and since he was the one who opened up the seal, anything that happens as a consequence of that is the wrath of God, in my opinion. Now, I know some people don't believe that, so some people believe that the wrath of God instead starts here in Revelation chapter 6, verse 12, and this is talking about the sixth seal judgment. And then it says, "Then I saw him open the sixth seal. A violent earthquake occurred. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The entire moon became like blood. And the kings of the earth, the nobles, the military commanders, the rich, the powerful, and every slave and free person hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, 'Fall on us and hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb.'" So some people believe that at the sixth seal judgment, that's when the wrath of the Lamb starts. And I believe the one person that I know for sure that I know personally that believes this is also believes, I think, that the tribulation actually begins at this point in time. So really, in my mind, they're also pre-tribulationists. They just disagree on when the tribulation actually starts. But so when we talk about pre-wrath, I think at the very first week I talked about those who believe in a pre-wrath rapture. I think all of us pre-tribulationists believe in a pre-wrath rapture because of the promises. And I picked two out of the book of Thessalonians, but if you read through the New Testament, it's full of verses that say that we're not destined for the wrath of God. And so I believe that whenever the God's wrath starts, that we're going to be protected from it. Now the question is when it starts. There's actually some extreme people that believe that the wrath doesn't start to the Revelation 14. Yet another angel who has authority over fire came from the altar, and he called with a loud voice to the one who had sharp sickle, use your sharp sickle and gather the cluster of grapes from earth's vineyard, because its grapes have ripened. And the angel swung his sickle towards the earth and gathered the grapes from earth's vineyard, and he threw them into a great winepress of God's wrath. I'm sure you guys have heard of the Okay, I'm sorry. I thought you agreed with the second position. I didn't know you agreed with the third position.
No, I mean, I definitely see that as God's wrath.
So this is definitely God's wrath. There's no doubt this is God's wrath. Is this the beginning of God's wrath is the question.
What you read in the sixth seal is also God's wrath. No doubt about
Right,
it.
okay.
The question is, go back to your telescope
Yeah.
imagery. Is it possible that the trumpets and the bowls are in the sixth seal of the telescope, not
the seventh seal? Okay. That's
Is that
interesting.
possible?
It's possible. It's clear that we do not have timelines when it comes to the seal and trumpet and bowl judgment. So it's hard to tell exactly when these things take place. So definitely that's possible. So we look at three examples from the Revelations where it talks specifically about, and I picked this first because everybody's heard the grapes of wrath before and may not know the origin. Well, the origin of that is this verse here. But there are different points in Revelation where God's wrath is clearly being exercised. The question is, when does it start? Because if we knew when it started, then we'd sort of know when we, as Christians, will be exempted from it. And so I want to believe that it starts at the very beginning of the first seal, because that obviously, not only is that my desire, but I also interpret the seal judgments in that way as well. But certainly there are good people that believe different things. The point of all this is I believe that as bad as these judgments are, that I'm thinking that we're not going to see most of them. I personally believe we're not going to see any of them, but I do also understand and that there are viewpoints that think we'll see a few of them.
Are the grapes the people? Is that what it is? Grapes are the people, and then they are.
So I think this is symbolic.
To the winepress that are there at the time.
I think this is symbolic. I think this is symbolic of God harvesting grapes specifically to create a wine of judgment, and it just being a symbolic thing about judgment. I don't think this is one of those things you take literally.
So,
So reminded it gives Babylon.
Yes, Matt.
touch the nerve with the wrath argument.
Okay.
So let me just share this. In Romans chapter 1, verse 18,
Okay.
it mentions God's wrath
Mm-hmm.
being poured out against the whole earth. And Paul's talking about that. Paul's talking about that God's wrath is being revealed from heaven.
It is in the process of being revealed. Yes.
Correct.
Okay.
So the wrath of God is ongoing. The question is whether, to what extent God is protecting His people from His wrath.
Okay. Yeah.
Not whether or not God's wrath is being poured out, because God's wrath is right now being poured out on His people.
So I disagree with that. So I think
you disagree with Romans 1:18.
no. So I think we're probably having a disagreement. It's okay, Amy. We're probably having a disagreement on what the word revealed means. So I think that would probably be where we would need to have a discussion: is what is God trying to say there when He says it's revealed?
So you're saying that no wrath of God is being unveiled on this earth at this moment. I think that's a tough argument to stand on.
I don't think I'm trying to say that, although, quite frankly, I think if you review what I just said, I probably was saying that.
Well, that's my point, is I don't believe that the wrath of God is non-existent now.
Yes.
I do think it's going to ramp up.
Okay, yes. Okay, so I agree with you, Matt. I do agree with you that when we're talking about the judgments and revelations, we're talking specifically about the wrath that God is bringing about in relationship to the day of the Lord, where the end times, where He's decided, okay, we're starting that clock again, that 7-year clock of Daniel. We're starting the timer kicking again. So I agree with you. There is God's wrath on the earth now, but I don't believe that. And I think that we do suffer from God's wrath. I don't know if we suffer specifically God's wrath intentionally on us, but certainly side effects of the wrath could be. So I believe you're right. There is something more to be unpacked there. And because we're almost at the end, I think we're going to nip that short. But I do appreciate Matt bringing that up because, and I think this was the point I was trying to make at the beginning of the class, which is it's very subjective when persecution and trials of this world become the revealing of the tribulation time where God's wrath is going to be intensified on this earth. And Matt brings up some really good points about us being protected from it. And I do think what I really wanted people to take out of tonight is God's wrath is coming and it's going to be intensified. But as Christians, we shouldn't fear it. But we should also not be confused and think that we are going to be exempt from all manners of suffering. That Christ pretty much promised us that if we followed him, we would suffer. And if you're not suffering as a Christian, then perhaps you need to evaluate if you are a Christian. Because God pretty much promised us that if we were a Christian, we were going to be suffering some types of persecution. So I think God has a plan. And the past 3 weeks, we've been looking at this plan, and he is trying to do something. I believe that what he's trying to do, he doesn't need the church on earth to do, but it's entirely possible that he might leave us here as his servants. And so we need to study the scriptures and pray. But I also think we should remember that we serve a just and loving God. And 2 weeks from today, or 3 weeks from today, when on July 28th, I'm going to present the best evidence I can to show you that. And I'm going to give you a preview. It's the bride, it's the marriage ceremony of the Jewish people. And this is what turned me to a pre-trib viewpoint, like pretty drastically. And I think by sharing it, and I think a lot of you already are familiar with it, but going through it in detail and presenting it, especially in light of John chapter 14, I think it makes a pretty compelling piece of evidence that what God has intended for us um, is good, despite what's going with the world. One last time we look at this, we're trying to fill out this timeline, um, and I think we're getting there. So we're going to take a step backwards in 2 weeks and look at the tribulation. So next week, remember, we're off. We're not meeting. And then 2 weeks from now, we're going to go into this. Now, I made this slide before I made a detour, so I'm not sure. We're going to be talking about the rapture. I'm not sure if what and when is the right title for it. In 2 weeks, I will reveal the updated title. But I threw a bunch of stuff at you tonight. The question, I will likely say, I don't know if I have time to cover that right now. And I might even promise to email you some more information. But having said that, is there a question that I might be able to answer?
Well, this isn't a question.
Okay.
It's just an observation because I listened very carefully to what you said. I listened very carefully to what Matt said.
Yes.
And I don't see at all a conflict.
No, I don't.
Because what I perceived or interpreted was that, and I just looked again at the little timeline, the last thing you had flashed up there, was the second coming of Christ.
Right.
So you notice that the tribulation is within that triangle. I do feel also, like what Matt said, that we are definitely experiencing as the church worldwide wrath. We're experiencing, I don't know if it's maybe it's all about but
trials. I think trials.
Great
yeah.
trials. I agree with you. They're ramping up.
Yeah.
I see that what I think is interesting. I absolutely agree with everything that Matt said.
Yeah.
You said, but the key is, I think, the second coming of Christ. That Christ, I think that he's going to come and then the judgments. It's not going to be.
Well, so
that. So that would be the ultimate ramp. The ultimate.
He will come after all the judgments, but he will at some point ramp up those judgments.
Yeah,
yes. Yeah.
big, to the point where oceans are dying.
Yeah.
And they're turning to blood. That's beyond anything that we know right now. Right now, we're going through some intense stuff as the church and as just people culture.
Yeah.
So
And if you think we are suffering here, trust me, we've got it great compared to yeah, well, and to other parts of the world too. I mean, you talk about people in China and Iran that are just literally being killed for their faith, and so yeah.
Yes. Your website or how I can get a
Okay.
hold of you on.
Okay, so go. Okay, so first of all, crossroadsfamily.org is the website, or Crossroads Carmichael, but crossroadsfamily.org. Dawn at crossroadsfamily.org is my email address. Matt is Matt. So if you um, go to the web, if you go to our church website, go to the eGroups tab, and then scroll down till you see the prophecy. Crossroads Carmichael or Crossroads Family. It's just search for Crossroads. Go to Google and search for Crossroads Church Carmichael. We'll come right up. And then go to the eGroup tab and then scroll down till you see the prophecy, end times prophecy class, and you'll notice that it's actually a link. And if you click on the link, you go to the webpage.
And Don, I just want to mention that what's up on this slide right now, pretty much, as far as I know, every elder in the church agrees with this type of progression.
That's good to
You
know.
know, I mean, we all are in unity around the idea that we're in the church age. There's going to come a time of great tribulation. Once the church age comes to a conclusion, and then Jesus Christ will come again. He'll usher in the 1,000-year reign, and then we have Satan loose. That's described later. But the real question or the debate, the stuff that
the question is always not what is, but when.
Is not about is that tribulation 7 literal years? Is it 42 months? Is it just a few weeks and enough time for him to unleash the bowl judgments? That's where we kind of get into it a little bit and debate.
And that's really literally that's why I started with Daniel, the prophecy of Daniel, rather than jumping ahead to here, is because I did want to set the foundation for why I believe it is 7 years because of that 70th week of Daniel.
That's a very good argument. The Daniel week that's left for the Jews.
It's just so interesting because the Bible doesn't specify if things happen simultaneously or if they happen within hours of each other or they happen within years. So that's all an unknown, that we're not.
So I just wanted to emphasize the unity of those of us that are leading the church. And our little internal skirmishes sometimes.
They're always on minor points, not on nothing major. Yeah. So I'm gonna at this point I'm gonna close the class down. You certainly, if you want to stick around and we can talk some, but I do want to close the class because I usually close late. I want to at least close a little early today. So Matt, would you pray for our class?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Heavenly Father God, we're just so grateful